Good evening. It is Thursday. Let's see if the thing is on. Good evening. It is Thursday, February 16th, 2023 at 6 p.m. We are at the District Service Center in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. At this time, we'd like to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the land of the Minnewacan, Dakota people. Minnewacan means dwellers of the Spirit Lake. Our first agenda item is our roll call. Dana, will you call the roll?
Eric Chesner.
Here.
Louise Hines.
Here.
Pat Driscoll.
Here.
Melinda Doles is absent. Katie Schwartz.
Here.
Simi Petnaik.
Here.
Sharon Van Leer.
Here.
Emmy Popoff.
Here.
Maddie DeStasio.
Here.
Tomi Omiwade.
Here.
Thank you. Next, will you please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Our next item is 3.0, and that is the approval of our agenda. May I get a motion to approve our agenda?
So move. Second.
Moved by Pat. Yes. Louise. Second by.
Second by Louise. I moved it. Second by
Oh, okay. I'm looking at y'all like you're. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carried. The next item on our agenda is 4.0, and that is our student district ambassadors, and they will be presented this evening by our superintendent, Julie Nielsen.
Fabulous, thank you. Today we had the opportunity to have, I believe, our third meeting, and it was a virtual meeting with our students. And I think as leaders, we forgot how much fun it was to have students virtually. And I know Emmy had a little hard time getting on. Some students with their devices were actually showing us the ceiling. And so we were kind of troubleshooting, and when we got done, we reminded ourselves that this is what a classroom could be like. And so it was great to have the kids all back together. And it is one of our favorite highlights to have students here with us. And a reminder for the board and the people in the community that students get to select and sign up to be present at our board meetings. So the first thing I'm going to ask our students to do, and we'll just go one right down the row, is just to introduce yourself, your name, your grade, and your school, and what makes you a good ambassador. And so I'm going to have Emmy start, and then we'll move to Maddie and Tomi. So Emmy, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Emmy Popoff. I am from elementary school, Cottage Grove Elementary, and I am in 5th grade.
And Emmy, what makes you a good ambassador?
I feel I make a good ambassador because I will listen to others' feelings and how they are feeling. I will listen to what their ideas are and make sure that they are heard and able to join in.
Thank you.
I'm Maddie DeStasio. I'm in 7th grade, and I go to Oltman Middle School. I think that I'm a good student ambassador because a lot of people like my positive spirit, and I like to be a leader.
Hi, my name is Tomi Omiwade. I am in 11th grade, and I go to Woodbury High School. What I think makes me a good student ambassador is kind of a joke that we have in my friend group is that I've tried every club in our school at least once. So I've played sports, I do soccer and track. I'm in a lot of school activities like speech, National Honor Society, different things like that. So I know a lot of different groups in my school, and I think using that, I'm able to share that with other representatives.
And you may see Tomi sneak out just a little bit because if I recall, she does have a speech practice that she needs to get to. So next we're going to have just Emmy talk a little bit, Emmy, about what you've been working on in school with your student ambassadors and what you have learned so far this year as a district ambassador.
So one of the things that I've been working on in my ambassador group is working on like what does the school want, what do we want, like what is going good in our school, what's going bad, what should we change. So we're basically working on hearing students' voices and making sure that they are feeling like they are welcomed into our school. And one of the things that I like is that we have like all these inclusion activities and we make sure that everyone here is voices is heard. And I feel like I've learned as an ambassador is that our voices are heard when we are at these meetings. So they try their best to be able to get us what we need or what we are feeling that we could change.
And maybe, Emmy, before I'm going to have you open the mic there. Why don't you tell everybody who's here in the school board what some of your favorite things are about Cottage Grove Elementary School in terms of your classes and what you like to do?
Okay, so when I'm in my classroom, I like to have the morning meetings because I get to learn more about everyone and what they prefer and how they're feeling with their classroom. And every day we do like an activity, so I like how our teacher is making sure that we are active and not bored, and she makes sure that she checks in on us and makes sure that we are okay, make sure that if we need to take a walk, if we need to take a break, she makes sure that we are okay. And I like how our principal is nice and makes sure we are okay as well.
Thank you, Emmy. Maddie, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're working on in school and then our morning session today?
We have been working on like what makes a good student, what makes a good staff member, what makes just like a good person in general. And we also have been doing like why are some of our like behavior issues in all the grade levels sometimes like different. And this morning we talked about like 3 things that our group had in common.
And Maddie, that was your welcome and inclusion, right? You
Yep.
had to come up with 3 things.
Mhm.
And I think one of them was liked sports, liked food. I was like, well, that's an original one, liked food. I forget what the food was. But what thing did you talk about next? I know you talked about your experience in school. And I know you got to hear from high schoolers as well.
We also talked about like things that could make our classrooms and school like better, or some things that could help your learning. Some of the high schools requested like more that you could like use the pod more often and more seating in the pod. Some people also requested like flexible seating.
Great. And Tomi?
So what we've been working on in our school, we've kind of been trying to find ways to increase awareness about student ambassadors, like at least in our school, because as we're like representatives of the people at our school, it's good to hear what they think so that we can bring those back to meetings and share and be like a good representation of everyone. So we actually we created a Google form, and we put it on our school's website so that students can put feedback of what they think we should talk about at our meetings or things they have concerns about. We've also been trying to think of ways to implement like projects or like concerns that we have talked about in our meetings, and then share those with different clubs that we think will be able to address those. So yeah, really just increasing awareness about student ambassadors and finding ways for people who aren't an ambassador to also participate in our process.
And Tomi, what would you say about being a district ambassador? When our students come together, they tend to go into grade level. So we have our elementaries at tables, middle school. Our high school tends to be the most interactive. Once they got to know each other, they're all talking. And so what have you found to be the most valuable as a high schooler?
I think the very first meeting that we came here, I didn't realize how excited I was to like see the other high schoolers, because I mean, obviously when I'm at my school, I'm with the other kids in my class and I see them every day, but the kids from other high schools, it was just so interesting to interact with them. And then being with other grade levels, it's been a while since I've been in middle school. It's been a while since I've been in elementary school. So getting to hear what things are like now when I've been out of those classrooms for 3-4 years is very intriguing.
And maybe just to close up, I know, Tomi, you talked about today with our group an event that you are going to be part of next Friday. Do you want to just share that with our board and the community?
Yeah, so Eastridge is hosting on the 24th, next Friday, from 6 to 9 p.m., a Black Influence event. A lot of the BSUs from different high schools have been working hard to put together performances for that event. There's going to be food, entertainment. I will be performing a piece I wrote during the event, so you guys should everyone should come on Friday, next Friday.
And I will just wrap up. I spent quite a bit of time with the elementary group. And you're right, Tomi. I think as we watch our students progress from elementary to middle and high school, the values, what's important, what people notice. They were asked, what's one thing you feel every elementary school should have and why? And Emmy, do you remember what? You may not have been in there, Emmy. You probably were still locked out of the meeting. The top one was every Monday we should have ice cream, and that would really motivate kids to come to school. So we like all ideas, big and small. And so thank you to Tomi, Maddie, and Emmy for being with us. I know that Tomi will need to sneak out in a little bit, and I think Maddie and Emmy would like to hang in there as long as possible, but we also have given them permission to dismiss themselves. And thank you to the parents for bringing them in.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you, young people, for sharing. And to you parents, these are some fabulous kids. And you should be very, very proud of them. Thank you. The next item on our agenda is 5.0, comments to the board. At this time, individuals may speak to the school board on any item relating to South Washington County Schools. The board will not respond to or discuss your comments. Character abuse or specific complaints identifying staff, students, or task force members will not be permitted. The students may be asked to prepare a response to your concerns. Speakers are permitted to speak up to 3 minutes in total. At 3 minutes, the microphones will be turned off and we will move on to the next agenda item. Tonight, we have 2 people who have signed up. Our
items. All consent items are considered routine and non-controversial by the school board and will be approved by a single motion. Prior to this meeting, board members have had the opportunity to review each of these items and could have requested that any item be moved to the action items for individual consideration. Can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda items?
So moved.
Second. Moved by Eric, seconded by Louise. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? All right.
Next on our agenda is 7.0, and that's the information items. And we will deal with 7.1, demographics update, and that will be presented this evening by our Executive Director of Finance and Operations, Dan Pine.
Good evening, Chair Van Leer, school board members, student representatives, Superintendent Nielsen. We're going to talk about numbers for about the next 60 minutes, so hold on to your hats. After the August 2022 bond election, we began another information journey. We conducted community listening sessions to get feedback on the election. We had surveys done, surveyed 500 random sample to find out the feelings on our elections and our long-range facility plan. And we also had a new demographic study done. As we move forward to our next long-range facility plan, we wanted to make sure, what the numbers look like. And tonight, we're going to have the results of the study done by Hazel Reinhardt Consulting, and Hazel Reinhardt will be presenting the results of her first study. Hazel has a lot of experience. She'll probably tell you a little bit about it, but I do know that she was our state's first demographer, and that's quite an honor. Some things will be a little different from the previous demographic study done by Davis, demographics. One thing that you'll notice too is we're looking 5 years out. And the last study we did, we were bringing numbers that were 10 years out. Not to say that one way is right or wrong, but we did get feedback from the community that it's hard for people in these times to look too far ahead. So we figured that if we get some good numbers or some ideas for the next 5 years, that we can put together a plan based on that. With that, I'll turn it over to Hazel, and she will present the results of her study.
Thank you very much, Dan. Madam Chair, board members, superintendent, it's my pleasure to be here. I think somehow the top of this slide is not showing because I don't think I simply said county public schools. It's my pleasure to be here, and as I often say, I'm more enthusiastic about this than any of the listeners, so I'll try to be mindful of that. The first thing I want to talk about a little bit is that we're in a very different environment than we were a few years ago, and it really behooves us to recognize that as we think about the future. I think probably the most important change that has been occurring and affects school enrollment, because after all, school enrollment or going to school is compulsory by age, and hence it's a subset of the general population. But the number of births in the United States and Minnesota have been decreasing because of lower levels of fertility. And by that we mean simply that women are having fewer children by the time they end their childbearing years. And it has resulted in a decrease in births, even though the number of women has increased. And the consensus among demographers is that the pandemic will result in fewer births. And incidentally, we never recovered births that were lost with the Great Recession of 2008 and later. So we've had a declining fertility rate. Now, in 2020 in the U.S., births were the lowest they've been since 1979. So that's a long time. But births were up 1% in 2021. We don't know about Minnesota. Our Department of Health is a little slow in getting these numbers out, and especially since the pandemic. And then to remember that fertility rates vary by race, ethnicity. The other thing is that we have less mobility That is, people move about less. Following the Second World War for many, 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 many years, at least 20% of all Americans changed their address every year. Now that dropped very sharply to 8.4% in the last year. So we're just having less mobility. People are staying in their homes, staying in their places much longer. And of course, that topic that I often say we're so tired of talking about, the aging of the population, and some of us especially, since it happens to all of us. But it's a very significant thing, because once a population grows old, it can never get young again. And that is what is happening to us, is that we're growing old and we're not alone. It's a global phenomena. And maybe you read in the paper, which is very significant, that China posted more deaths than births this past year. And that is really a sign that population simply can't grow when that happens. But it has some very short-term implications, different demand for mix-in housing, smaller percentage of households have children, which affects school enrollment. Or I like to say, you're not going to get out of chauffeuring your children for play dates, because there aren't going to be many kids in the neighborhood. Then Minnesota is back to a pattern of net out-migration, and by that I mean that more people are leaving the state of Minnesota every year than move to it. So that our growth rate is very, very low right now. And then, of course, subject of competition for students. That is a public policy supported by public policy, and we have many state-funded forms of competition, and it is increasing every year. It's not decreasing, it's increasing every year. Now, let's look at COVID, because that is something we have to deal with as well. In Minnesota and in the U.S., public school enrollment decreased in the 2021 school year. It was marked by kindergarten classes being smaller as students attended no school, simply kept at home, were homeschooled or attended a non-public school. The other elementary grades were also harder hit. Middle school and high school enrollment was less affected. And now we've had a recent study out that shows that in the United States, we have lost 1 million public school kids from the pandemic, and we can't seem to find where they are. They don't seem to be in homeschools, at least as reported, non-public and the like. So everybody's scratching their head as to what happened. So what happened in this school district? Well, I would say that the effect, given your size, was pretty minimal. A lot of districts were much harder hit. However, you've had some post-pandemic changes that are a little curious. Kindergarten was below its expected size in the pandemic year, 2021. You had a decline in enrollment of 218 students, which was new phenomena for you. And you had a net migration that was reduced to a mere 97 students. So it had some effect, but compared to your size of enrollment, pretty minimal. Students shifted to other options. Homeschool increased everywhere. But what's interesting here to me is in this district, non-public enrollment and charter school enrollment increased after the pandemic year in 2021, 22, and again in 22, 23. So with that kind of background, let's look a little bit at enrollment history. It tells us something about what's going on and what we might anticipate. Your enrollment, excluding early childhood, increased by 1,316 students, or 7.6% in this 10-year period from 2012-13. Now, that has been affected by a one-time event, your purchase of Valley Crossing School. And because it's a one-time event, I don't think there's another school you can purchase in this next 10 years. So that won't happen again. Resident enrollment also increased by a little higher percentage, and your non-resident students make up 2.6% of your enrollment, which is a very, very low percentage in the metro area, very low percentage. And you have a net loss of students to other public options. It's been going on for some time, not unusual. It's not a high percentage, but it's present. Market share of 82.3% of what I estimate to be the school-age population of the district. And this is a very high percentage for a Twin Cities area metro school district. Very, very high. And then competition for students increased during the pandemic. And here I'm looking at South Washington Public Schools here compared to the state of Minnesota as a whole for 2021 on these education choices. And you can see that you have a smaller percentage of your entire enrolled student body enrolled anywhere who are residents of the district than the state as a whole. And you can see open enrollment accounts for 9% of all enrolled students in Minnesota are moving one place or another. They're not happy with the school district they live in. So in essence, they're changing the boundaries. And you can see only 1.8% of your students in 2021 were non-residents, and only 2.6% of your resident students left the district. So that's through open enrollment. As far as charter schools, the percentage is pretty equal to the state. And then you can see the difference in the capture rate. And a capture rate here in the Twin Cities metro area, excluding Minneapolis and St. Paul, is more around 71, 72%. So you can see how much higher yours is. Here we want to take a look at our enrollment, and I just want to clarify that while it excludes early childhood, it includes the ALC and NEXT. And really, what we want to take a look at here is the non-residents. And in fact, 10 years later, you have slightly fewer non-residents than you had 10 years earlier. And then you'll note that large number 687 in the 2016-17 school year, that was the year you acquired Valley Crossing. You got non-resident students that year, and most of them left and went back to their district of residence in the following year. One of the things that demographers like to look at, because this is the same phenomena that we would look at in a total population. We look at change, we look at the two components of change, and basically there are only two. One is natural increase, decrease in the general population. It's births versus deaths. In a school enrollment, it's the difference in the size of the incoming kindergarten class compared with the previous year's grade 12. Okay? And a negative number means that incoming class was, or kindergarten, was smaller than the previous year's grade 12. And then net migration measures movement across district boundaries and or the movement between non-public, public schools, charter schools, whatever. So again, you can see that 1,316 is the change in the 10-year period, and that change is the results from natural increase, decrease, and net migration. So you can see that change between the fall of 2015 and the fall of 2016, that's 766, which again is influenced by Valley Crossing. And you can see the 950, because some of these are your own resident students, but that was a separate district. So you see those numbers. And then you can see that in that 10-year period, your enrollment, if you will, think about it, depressed by 2,400 students because kindergartens were smaller than the outgoing grade 12. And that's an important concept because that's going to continue, and that puts downward pressure on enrollment. And then you see what the net migration was. And then here we can look at enrollment numbers, and I just want to highlight what I tend to look at. I look at that top row across at kindergarten to see how much it has changed. And again, we see that between the 2015-16 year and 2016-17, we had the jump in kindergarten, again, Valley Crossing. And then since that, kindergarten, even though we've had a lot of growth in the district, has not increased very much. Then if I look, another thing I look at is the rightmost column, the most recent year, to look at the, and here we can clearly see that there's a difference in the size of grades as between kindergarten, elementary, and the high school grades. And that's a good predictor right there that we're going to continue to have natural decrease, because those classes will, large classes will continue to graduate out of the system. And then if you look at the diagonal, that's how we calculate net migration. Going from the kindergarten of 2012-13, 1,153. In first grade, there was 1,215 of them. Then there's 1,278, and on until grade 10 this year, and there are 1,509, which shows us the effect of net migration on that grade, which is, I call a cohort, but like that. So with that kind of sense of background, let's turn ourselves attention to the projections. And there are a couple of things that are really important here. One is I want to just state some underlying assumptions. One is that the decline in resident births in Minnesota and Washington County will result in smaller kindergartens in the next several years. And I'll show you the numbers on that. In other words, I don't think you're going to escape that phenomenon. And then I made the assumption that Washington County's share of Minnesota resident births will increase in the next 5 years. Now, if you're only thinking about a 5-year projection, this really doesn't matter, because this assumption affects the second 5 years of a 10-year projection. Because the first 5 years of that projection number, all those children have been born, okay? And the other assumption I made is that your share of Washington County's resident births will increase a little bit in the next 5 years. And then excluding the pandemic year, I would argue that we have seen survival rates associated with substantial increase in housing units, so that we have survival rates that we can apply and have confidence in, that they will be good predictors of what continued housing unit growth will be like. So this is another very, very important. It's resident births. That term has a very specific meaning. It means on the birth certificate, the mother provided an address that could be coded to Washington County, Minnesota, without regard to where the child was born. And then it's also coded to a municipality, but at this moment, you can't get any of that data from the state health department because they're very preoccupied with other things. Now, in this 14 years are shown here, 2006 to 2020. The peak birth year in that period was in 2007 in the state, and you will see in Washington County, the largest birth year of these 14 was 2006. And if you look at that, births have declined. Resident births in Washington County have declined since 2006, virtually every year, even though the county has had substantial population increase. Now, as we turn to the future, I'm looking at what the Minnesota Demographic Center has projected for 0-year-olds. Again, doesn't affect the first 5 years of the projections, but it affects the second 5 years. And these projections were made based on 2015-16 data, and as you can see, they overprojected the number of births in 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020. In fact, the projection for 20 was 70,325, and actual births were 63,451. So I felt going forward, I have to adjust those numbers downward. But I didn't want to take the pandemic effect in it, so I based it on 2019 and adjusted it downward by 90, so that it's 93.8% of the projected number, and that you see in the right at 65,000 some. Now, the important thing here is look at how flat those numbers are. So in other words, we can't expect any kind of lift to kindergarten. That as we move forward, it's just a flat number. So So that we have that context now. Now, births are reported on a calendar year basis, and you have to be 5 years of age on September 1st to enter school in Minnesota. So I want to adjust this calendar year to this academic year. And about a third of all children are born in the last September 1st to December 31st. So I make that adjustment, and I call it the kindergarten pool. And the pool I'm going to use for you is Washington County as a proxy. And then the percentages you see is the percentage your kindergarten is of that Washington County pool. And again, you can see how that increased between 15 and 16 from 4215 to 4637. Again, Valley Crossing primarily is the reason. And then you see it moved around, dipped in the pandemic year to 43.23 and has rebounded, but it has not reached the 48%. So the assumption I'm making here is a key one. I'm looking in the projections to look at that kindergarten birth ratio, and I chose two assumptions here. One would be a low one. It's the average of the 3 years prior to the pandemic plus the past year. So I'm picking up the higher percentages there, and that averages to 47.5%. And then I chose another one somewhat arbitrarily, moving it up a whole percentage point to 48.5 in that assumption that your share will increase. Then longer term, I looked at the past 14 years, and Washington County resident births increased from 4.03 to 4.20% of Minnesota resident births. I looked at the 5-year average, which was an increase of 2.19, and I applied that to the next 5 years. So you can see, as we, especially, I know you said you're not going to look at the second 5 years, but these are the assumptions that make a big difference in the second 5 years. In other words, they're giving you a little more growth. So it's then very simple. I have the pool, and I have these percentages, and it's a simple thing of multiplying them. And I want to go back to this one. What I want to call your attention to is that we have 3 years of pools here to the kindergarten of 2025-26. And notice how those numbers are going down. Not dramatically per se, but going down. So I've now created the pool. The bolded number, of course, is 2022-23. I'm multiplying these percentages by the pool, and you can see the kindergarten projections that result. And then as a way of comparison, I've looked at how many kindergarten students you had in the past 10 years, 12,759. And as you can see, projection, 13,045 or 13,319. So I'm projecting more kindergarten students than you had in the past. Now we want to look at the diagonal, the migration. Now here's some really interesting numbers. You can look at the bottom line. You can see that big migration number between the fall of 15 and the fall of 16. And you can see its effect in the kindergarten to first grade, all those elementary grades, what that brought in. The other thing that's very interesting here, and this is fairly typical of a Minnesota school system, is that you have a net inflow at grade 8, from grade 8 to 9, the entry of high school. And you can see those numbers. And then, interestingly, starting in the fall of 2016 to fall of 2017, you start to have a net out migration between grades 5 and 6, which means at the end of elementary and before the start of middle school. Now again, none of these numbers are large, okay? But the significance to me is that when you could have thought of picking up somewhere 65, 70 kids at the transition into high school, that's really cut about in half with what's lost in the transition to middle school.
Hazel, can I ask a question, or would you prefer to wait till the end?
Pardon?
Can I ask a question, or would you prefer I wait to the end?
You can ask it now.
So my question is, between 15 and 16, and then the next.
These are falls now, remember, fall, not the school, fall.
Right, sorry, yeah, the falls.
Yeah.
So you said for the 15 to 16, that is the increase in the elementary years is Valley Crossing coming in, and then the decrease between 5 and 6, is that the students from Valley Crossing leaving?
Well, I can't answer that question. We know that many of them left. Until we would, to answer your question, we need to look at resident enrollment or non-resident enrollment grade by grade to know whether this is concentrated among non-residents or not.
Okay.
But my point is, that remains the same. It doesn't matter whether they are residents or non-residents. It sort of cuts in half of the number that you would have said, oh, we can account sort of for this many more coming in at high school. And then I want to draw your attention to the large net in-migration of 21 to 22, 484 students. And that marks a year of a pretty exceptional increase in single-family housing units. The previous year, 336. I want to avoid the pandemic year, fall of 18-19, 371. So we have a string of pretty large net in-migration to focus on. Now, we saw the raw numbers when they're converted to percentages, the percent that survived to the next grade, if you will. We call them survival rates, which accounts both for migration and death, although death is very low among school-age children. And you can see, with the exception of 5 to 6, all of these numbers are above 1.000, and at 1.000, we know that the same number of students moved on to the next higher grade. So what this tells us is kindergarten to first grade, in the low assumption, you get 3.9% bump. In the high, you get 4% bump. See how that works. And what's interesting, and because, of course, of the ALC, you have a high percentage between 11 and 12. Okay? So, if you will now, in the cohort survival method, which is the traditional way of projecting population, we have made assumptions about kindergarten, which are based on births and the like, and we have migration assumptions or survival rates. And in applying them, it's basically marrying, if you will, the low and the high of each of those assumptions. So what do we see in 10 years? Well, we had 18,606 enrolled in 22-23, so 10 years out. I'm projecting 19,274 to 19,938, or a 3.6% to 7.2% enrollment increase. Now, what I want to call your attention to is that 7.2 is very, very similar to what you had in the past 10 years, which was a 7.6. Okay? Now I'll talk a little bit. I don't think it's going to be at the higher end, but I can see what it is. Now, in these projections, we know that the kindergarten is projected to be smaller than the previous year's grade 12, so natural decrease continues. And it's going to be larger than it was in the past because we've got some large cohorts going out. And net migration projected to continue, and it's comparable to what we've had in the projections show. This is cut off here, 400 to 450 a year. Okay? So here's what the numbers look like. And as you can see in these, that here the assumptions about kindergarten have the largest effect because the two lowest ones have the low kindergarten projection and the two highest projections have the high kindergarten. Okay? And if it were the migration, it would be just the opposite of it. And then I've divided these as you structure your schools, K-5, 6, 8, 9, 12. Both the 5-year, and again, I want to stress in the 5 years, all children have been born for the K-5. In 6-8, in the first 5 years, not even the assumptions made in kindergarten affect those students. This is simply the number in the grades now and the migration rates. And at the high school level, you go out 8 years before you have any effect of any kindergarten assumption. So that's totally a function of kids currently enrolled as they age with the survival rates or net in migration. Now, what could make these projections too high? Well, projected kindergarten could be too high. More students could choose other education options. Projected in migration too high. Too low, I think the only thing could be if projected kindergarten is too low. I don't think the other factors will be there. Now, one of the challenges in this district is this rapid growth in housing. And I just want to share with you, I've been doing this for 30 years already. And about 15, 17 years ago, I stumbled upon a way of overlaying school enrollment with housing and tax records. And I thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. But I found out that the relationship between housing and K-12 enrollment is a very complex one. And while housing, you might think of it, it is like DNA. You need it there. But it is not a very good predictor of school enrollment. And especially in a district like yours, which now has thousands of existing housing units. And even though you're adding a large number, it's a very small percentage to what already exists. And it's very dangerous to make the assumption that the new units will automatically translate into additional enrollment. Because over and over again, when you have natural decrease and you have these other phenomena, doesn't translate immediately to it. So what I have learned, and I've done this in 4 states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Colorado, is that unit type affects school age child per unit yield. And the most important unit type is single family detached units. That the newer single family units yield more students per unit than older units. So what's the new unit? Well, I have to tell you, it's about anything built 2000 and later. Now you say that's already 23 years old. But it marks a shift in the type of unit in both square footage and certain amenities. That as single-family detached units sell, student yield usually increases if the units are relatively new, the turnover. It usually decreases if they're older units. Okay? So, for example, I live in a single-family home that was built in 1957. 3 bedrooms, not going to produce many kids, that type of unit. The market value, this is very counterintuitive. People think that affordable units and what makes something affordable varies from district to district will have more school-age children. No. It's the middle and even the very most expensive units that yield the most school-age children. So what it says to me is that families choose what they can afford in a district and they move toward the most expensive housing in that district, whether it's $250,000 or $750,000. My experience in Minnesota is that after units reach about 1.5 million, then you have a decline in school-age kids going to public school. They tend to go to private school after that. So these things. So I say these states, and single-family detached varies by school district and by attendance area within school districts. And I've not worked in a single district where every attendance area had the same yield, if you will. Now, what's interesting, townhouses, apartments, and condominiums are very consistent across all school districts across those states. And townhouse, which your nomenclature is multifamily here, they yield 0.22. So you need 100 units to get 22 students. Apartments, very consistent, 0.11 to 0.15, and condominiums have almost no school-age children, 0.02 to 0.05, which is off the chart here. So let's look at what happens here. We have this discussion here of whether these are actually 5-year periods. The point of this is that I think we have 2 equal periods here in time. Maybe they're 2 4-year periods. But 2019 to 2022 represents units that have already been built, okay? And 2023 to 2026 represents what local officials project will be built. And my point in this simply is that across the board, this says that the housing growth will slow somewhat. Not tremendously, but somewhat. And then I looked at, okay, how do we come to understand this less than perfect relationship between housing and students? So I look at your resident enrollment between 2018-19 and 2022-23, and the increase was exactly 238 students, resident students. In that time period, you had a natural decrease of 1,050 students, resident students. You had a net in-migration of 1,288, so you still had a plus. But then when we look at residents attending elsewhere, we have 1,746. Not a large number, not a large percentage, neither of them are, but they do add up. And then when we consider that in 2018-19, that comparable number attending elsewhere was 1,269, which we assume some of those are may still be about. And then I look at you in this time period, you had an additional housing units of 5,758. And I took a year's lag time. You could finesse this around and say, oh, maybe a third of them, should be moved to another year, of which 3,090 were single family. And I'm estimating from these units based on 0.50 to 0.55 for single family detached, the 0.22 for multifamily, and the 0.11 for apartments, that would have yielded 1,931 to 2,086 students. Okay, so you can see that number, I don't doubt that number of students were in those units, maybe even some more, but they didn't translate into additional enrollment because of natural decrease and the number of students leaving the district for other education options. Okay? So, moral of the story here, additional housing units, even those with school-age children, do not automatically translate into additional enrollment. And the issues are both methodological and in the assumptions you make. So with that, I want to say thank you for indulging me to talk probably longer than you are interested in listening. I know that you're looking at only 5 years, and I've presented 10. Just remember what I've said about 5 years. All those kids are born. Greatest impact on K-5. Middle school, not impacted by those kindergarten assumptions in the first 5 years, and high school takes a long, long time to be impacted by those assumptions. And continued housing growth. I think the survival rates we've seen, especially the last year, bringing in 480 some students. We said that projections are showing 400 to 450, which I think is adequate to cover the additional housing that's projected. And so with that, when you do this kind of work, you're never 100% right. But I do think we're reasonably close here. So I want to thank you very much. And Dan is giving me the hook here.
No.
No.
They're going to ask questions.
Yeah, thank you, Hazel, for, that's a lot to digest, I'm telling you. Board members, do you have questions? You were thorough. Uh-oh. One. Go ahead, Sydney.
I just had a question. You had mentioned in your presentation that one thing that was different about our district versus other districts was that our private and charter school net out-migration increased post-pandemic. And so I'm assuming that in other districts, that effect
It
was...
occurred immediately in the pandemic.
Okay.
I don't know, there's a new piece of research out, and I don't know if you've seen it or not, the one that makes the estimate of 1 million missing public school kids. But it appears from that research, which focused heavily on the state of Michigan, that no matter what decision the public school system made, they lost students. If they made one decision, it sent them to homeschools. If they made the other, it sent them to private schools. So it's just, I like to point out what I hope people will focus on to say, okay, why is this happening now in that post-pandemic? We've had this little uptick. Again, I want to stress, as a percent of your enrollment, this is minuscule. But, you know, we do know every student represents dollars.
So my follow-up maybe is for you, Dan, I'm not sure. But, you know, on CFAC, you're always presenting enrollment projections, and you talk a lot about cohort survival rate, and that's what you use to project out our budget. How do your cohort survival numbers align with Hazel's cohort survivor numbers?
Well, if you can just wait 10 minutes, it's actually one of my slides, so I could probably show you. But it's my numbers are lower at this point.
And I would say that for someone who's dealing with the finances, being conservative is a good strategy. No, I don't think of my numbers as particularly conservative.
Any other questions? None? Okay. Thank you, Hazel. Next is 7.2, financial update, and that will also be presented this evening by our Executive Director of Finance and Operations, Dan Pine.
I guess I'll wait till this comes up. Good evening again. One more informational item concerning our budget. It's our financial update. So every month we give a financial update. Sometimes it's actual action you have to take. For instance, hopefully next month we'll bring the revised budget to you, and then in a couple months the preliminary budget for the next year, then levy information, things like that. This time of year we're kind of looking at how's our enrollment doing. As if you've not heard enough about enrollment, I can tell you more about enrollment. But actually, you know, what's going on with the budget, and you know that back in early 2021, the school board passed a 3-year budget reduction plan. And that included, you know, about $9 million of reductions in the general fund budget and an increase of about $300,000 in the revenue budget. And we split it into 3 years. Most of the dollars were seeking an increase of $6.6 million in operating levy, and that, thanks to the voters of the district, passed, and we were able to utilize those funds for the next 10 years. We also had approved adjustments in this current year, 22-23, of about $7.8 million, and adjustments in the budget for next year of about $7.8 million. So we implemented those changes in the 21-22 budget, and we were able to present a balanced budget. The 22-23 budget came out balanced. We're using a projected enrollment of 18,631 students. And I say students, and I talk in ADMs, average daily membership, but generally it's an average of when a student's in school, enrolled in school, because that's how we're paid. As of February 1st of this year, we are projecting about 18,694, which is an increase of about 63 students. And as you recall, on average, we're paid about $10,500 per student. That number's going up a little bit based on other factors of categorical aid. Our revenue is affected by the basic formula, which we'll talk about a little bit. And this is the largest portion of our revenue. You simply multiply the number of students by the basic formula. The basic formula, which is called the General Education Formula Allowance, this current year, it's $6,863 per student. Back in the year 2000, it was $4,966. Why? This is like the starting point that we've been taking as we look what happens over time. If that amount would have just been adjusted for inflation those years, it would be $8,126 right now. But it's not adjusted for inflation. It's determined every 2 years by the legislature, and sometimes they had a couple freezes. Sometimes they don't increase it at all. Other times they increase it at a rate less than inflation, and that results in a deficit to inflation of about $1,300 per student. As far as enrollment goes, now a lot of Hazel's numbers, so she uses kind of the butts in the seat method, and I use when the kids are enrolled. She takes the fall counts. I take the average counts for the whole year. But 1920 was actually our largest enrollment, about 18,754. The full pandemic school year of 2021, as she talked earlier, saw a drop to 18,502. The drop of 1.34% was less than most metro school districts, as Hazel talked earlier. And then back in 21-22, we rose up to 18,558, and right now we're projected about 18,694. So we're still lagging about 60 students behind that high mark in 1920. This is simply a chart that you can look at in more detail. We're not going to go over each one. It's very similar to the charts that you saw she did, and this is how I project enrollment. Basically the same way she does, although she puts a few other factors. I try to keep any emotion out of the equation. Big surprise, right? But I just basically say what happened between these grades in this year, in this period of time, and I take 10 years worth of information, calculate cohort survival rates, and plug them into the next 4 years. So as you can see on here, and then on this chart too, I like to look at where the high class is, just to kind of see if we have a bubble coming or if a bubble's leaving. But if you look on this one, I'm projecting 18,694 in 2023, and then you can see my projections based solely on a cohort survival method of 18,788 in 24, 18,939, 19. The point being, so then I took Hazel's numbers, and when I take her numbers, if you look in the report and say, Dan, where'd you get that number at? You have to add 300 to her numbers because she doesn't include pre-K, early childhood special ed, and the VPK. So I took her numbers and added 300 to hers, and you can see that I'm even more conservative than she is, because I'm projecting 18,788 in 24. She's projecting 18,972, and therefore, but they're pretty close. So you can see that my method is even more conservative, and that probably comes down to kindergarten because, albeit the numbers have gone down a little bit, we're at 48% of the births, and they've dropped a little bit down. I probably use about 45% of the births, and it has been difficult to get numbers lately from the health department. But I think one thing that we don't really notice a lot of, didn't really point out, but If you look at the numbers and you look at the population of our county, it's about 260,000 people. And our district is about 110 now, 112,000. About 38% of the population, but we're picking up 45 to 50% of the births into our public schools. So it could be a lot of things. I asked her if she knew any reason that was. One thing she has noticed, because she studies Stillwater also, this school district, that the Lake Elmo houses don't produce a lot of public school kids. And someone else pointed out to me, well, maybe we just have more people, younger families down here. But to pull in 45 to 50% of the kids into public schools when we only have 38% of the population is kind of a phenomenon. Anyway, so we take some of these numbers. We'll talk about financial forecasts a little bit. So a year ago, we were telling you, that I thought the fund balance would be about 7% at the end of 21, 22. It came in about 10%. The budget we're in right now was balanced, and it's supposed to leave us a fund balance of about 10%. There's a few things that have happened that have increased costs, and there's a few things that happen that increase some revenues too, but basically we're looking at an extra $1.5 million in services, and that's mostly attributable to increased costs in utilities, gas and water and such, electricity, and then snow events. Our snow removal budget is already about 100,000 above budget already, and hopefully it won't snow anymore. And then we did settle some contracts with a very large group, the paras, and we wanted, for labor retention reasons and just having a good contract settlement. That cost us about $1.5 million more than we normally would have budgeted. So right now, it's too early to predict what's going to happen next financial year, 23-24, mainly because of the funding sources, and I'll talk about that for a little bit in a little bit, and contract settlements. We have over $200 million in contracts, $200 million worth of contracts to settle in the next fiscal year. The main reason I say about funding sources is because of legislative actions. This session is a funding session, as you probably all know. Going into the year, the state is with about a $17 billion surplus. The governor has presented his budget. His budget increased the basic formula that we talked about earlier, 4% in year 1 and 2% in year 2. But there are bills out there that increase it by 5% in each year. When you look at the formula numbers, just consider 1%, it's about $1.4 million in new revenue for the district. The governor also, the budget also funds half of the special education cross subsidy for each district. For us, it'd be about $10 million if that passed. And there are bills out there that actually fund almost the whole cross subsidy. So basically, stay tuned, and we'll let you know what's going on with that. With that, that's your update, and of course, we'll take any questions or
Board, any questions?
information only, so.
Okay.
You answered my most important one, so I feel bad I don't have anything else.
That's okay.
Okay. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
Next item on our agenda is 8.0, which are action items. 8.1 are the proposed policy changes, and that will be presented by our superintendent, Julie Nielsen.
Thank you. This evening, we have 11 policies that have been reviewed and revised to reflect updates in the Minnesota statutes, definition of terms, legal references, as well as cross-references. Our board policy committee members reviewed the policies and made recommendations for board information and subsequent action. The school board members at our last meeting on February 2nd had the opportunity to review each of the policies individually. At that time, we also allowed for public comment, and there was no public comment. And so this evening, I am asking for approval on the 11 policies in your board packet.
Thank you. Can I get a motion to approve the changes?
So move. Second.
Moved by Pat and seconded by Katie. Is there any discussion or comments? Seeing none, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carried. Next is 8.2, and that is our 23-24 school calendar, and that also will be presented this evening by our Superintendent, Julie Nielsen.
Thank you again. Our district calendar for 23-24, and we know that we have families waiting on our district calendar. From the last board meeting, there is only one change, and that change does not have an impact on students. What you will note on the district calendar, it is up. Originally, we had an ATPPS day, Alternative Teacher Pay Performance System Day, for our staff, and it was set to be held on August 25th. And we have since moved that to September 25th, and that originally was a no school day for K-12. And so staff members will be using that September 25th day as an opportunity to reflect on where kids are at, to talk about their school improvement plans, and what goals they're going to be setting for the school year. So that is the only change from our last meeting. So with that, I am asking for approval of the 23-24 school year calendar.
Okay. May I get a motion to approve the 23-24 calendar?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Louise and second by Simi. Is there any discussion? Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carried. Next, we have 8.3, and that is the Minnesota State High School League grant application that will be presented this evening by our Assistant Superintendent, Christine Schaefer.
Good evening, School Board Chair Van Leer, Superintendent Nielsen, school board members, and student representatives. If you recall, we requested approval for the State High School League Foundation grant back in October of 2022, and that was Part A of the application. Tonight, we are requesting Part B of the application, and Part B is for funds for activities directors to work with student captains and student leaders in fine arts, activities, and athletics. So as part of this application, the High School League requires a Board of Director resolution to request the funds from the foundation. Park High School, Woodbury High School, and East Ridge High School have requested a grant of $5,000 in Category B, Student Leadership Training. The funds will be used to continue the high school's leadership development programming, which includes activities such as bringing in speakers to talk with students about leadership, having book studies about leadership, and this again is for all leaders, fine arts, activities, and athletics. So at this time, I would like to seek approval of the resolution to request funds from the Minnesota State High School League.
Thank you, Christine. Can I get a motion to approve the grant?
So moved.
Or second.
Okay, it was motioned by Eric and seconded by Katie. This is a roll call because it's a resolution. And Dana?
Eric Tessmer,
Yes.
Louise Hines.
Yes.
Pat Driscoll,
Yes.
Katie Schwartz,
Yes.
Simi Petnag,
Yes.
Sharon Van Leer.
Yes. Motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next is 8.4, and that is our Achievement and Integration Plan, and that will be presented this evening by our Assistant Superintendent, Kelly Jensen.
PowerPoint up so we're ready to go, but thank you. All right, good evening, Board Chair Van Leer, board members, Superintendent Nielsen, and student ambassadors. Tonight, we are here to ask for approval of our Achievement and Integration Plan in accordance with Minnesota Statute 124D 861. Mr. McGee, our Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Department, will provide a brief recap of the information that was presented at the workshop meeting, and then we'll be back to answer any questions you may have.
Okay.
All right, as a reminder, Achievement and Integration is a program that was established in Minnesota legislature to pursue racial and economic integration and increase student academic achievement, create equitable educational opportunities, and reduce academic disparities based on students' diverse racial, ethnic, and economic backgrounds. This was initially adopted in Minnesota State Legislature in 2013, and it essentially replaced the Integration Revenue Program, which was established in the 90s. SoWashCo participates in the Achievement and Integration Program as an adjoining district, and we've established a multi-district collaboration with 196, Rosemont, Apple Valley, Eagan, as well as District 834, which is Stillwater. By participating in this program, SoWashCo receives about $3.3 million in revenue. It is not the funding is not received based on achievement of goals, but we get the revenue by having our plan be approved by MDE and being part of the program. According to the state and the program, each plan must contain 3 types of goals. One is achievement disparities. We're looking at reducing the disparities in academic achievement among all students. And this excludes the categories of gender, disability, and English learners, as there's other funding and programming for students that qualify for those services. Number 2 is teacher equity, reducing the disparities in equitable access to effective and diverse teachers among all students. Once again, this is not including the categories of gender, disability, or English learner status. And finally, integration, increasing racial and economic integration, both in our district and with surrounding districts. What you're going to see proposed this year, and for the next 3 years, are 3 goals. Our goals fall into 3 categories: academics, relationships, and empowerment. Now, we know that all 3 of these goals, they spill into each other. We know that relationships have a proven effect, positive impact on student academic achievement, but we also have an academic-specific goal. So goal number 1, SoWashCo students will demonstrate self-efficacy, engagement, and proficiency in the academic expectations required to apply for a 4-year college or university. Goal number 2, our relationship goal. SoWashCo students, staff, and families have access to culturally affirming spaces and programming meant to build meaningful relationships in schools and communities. And finally, goal number 3, empowerment. SoWashCo students, staff, and families are empowered to frequently and efficiently access resources and programming offered by our district. Within these goals, and as you can see laid out in the plan, there are multiple key indicators of progress. These, the state has made it so that we are able to update those key indicators as we go through the next 3 years. If we find that there's an indicator that this is not the measure that we want, and so we're working right now very closely with our teaching and learning department to combine our efforts with MTSS, and is also with our executive cabinet as we're going through the strategic planning process. We want to make sure that what we're doing in achievement and integration is a supplement to what's already happening in our district, not its own standalone. Did I miss one? No, there we go. So the next steps for our achievement and integration plan. We're bringing it to the board tonight for approval. Once approved, we will be submitting to the state. This needs to be submitted to the state with board approval by March 15th. So I'm happy that we're ahead of the game here because the next step for us will then be to have a corresponding budget that also needs to be submitted to MDE. At this time, if there are any questions before we can move into the vote, I'll take those now.
First, I gotta get Can I get a motion to approve the plan first?
Second.
Moved by Katie, second by Simi. Are there any discussion or comments?
I have a few questions, if you don't mind. 3.3 million, can you explain in a little bit of detail as far as where that money goes, what it's spent on?
Yeah, so according to the way the budget is set up for achievement and integration, a minimum of 80% of that budget needs to be spent on direct student services. In our district, most of that is in AVID and for FTE, whether that's for cultural liaisons, academic success coaches, paying for FTE for AVID tutors, AVID coordinator, and AVID elective teachers. So most of the funding for achievement and integration goes into direct student services.
Can you explain what AVID is, please?
AVID, Advancement Via Individual Determination. Did I get that right? Okay. AVID is a program that we've had in the school district for a number of years. It is meant to empower students with strategies for learning, strategies for empowerment, strategies that will help them in either college or post-high school career paths.
Okay. I do have a few other questions, if you can bear with me, I appreciate it.
Sure.
In regards to the mentor, I was just reviewing the PowerPoint from the last meeting, because I was not at that meeting. In regards to the mentorship program for teachers of color, can you explain a little bit more about what that is?
Yeah, so, and actually, I'm glad that you brought that up. So that's not actually something that's funded through Achievement and Integration, but it is part, it's built into our key indicators of progress.
Okay.
So we currently received a grant from PELSB that is specifically for recruitment and retention of teachers of color. So when you look at, when you talk about specifically the mentorship for teachers of color, we're looking at setting up, in addition to the mentorship that we already provide for all of our year 1, year 2, and year 3 teachers, we provide mentorship, coaching, probationary professional development. This would be a supplement to that, knowing that often teachers of color are maybe one of few in a site, and there's often a feeling of isolation that's been expressed both here and in many metro districts. So this is an additional layer of support for those teachers, but it's a supplement to the mentorship program that we already have in place.
Can you explain what PELSB is?
PELSB. It's the licensing agency for the state of Minnesota for both teacher and administrator licenses.
Okay. I don't know if you have these numbers, but in regards to student population and the proportion of students that I guess would be considered students of color, I guess would be the proper term. What is the proportion of teachers that meet that category? As far, or closely?
I don't have that with me right now. I would say typically our past couple of years, I think we've been somewhere 3 to 5%, but I don't want to say something false from the stand. So if you could allow me to come back to that question, but we're in single digits for sure.
Okay.
Or Abby, Abby, are you able to answer that?
Yes,
as the HR
absolutely.
director?
Thank you.
How does that align with other school districts as far as their proportion of students? Does anybody know? I mean, I know these are kind of out of the blue questions, but.
I don't have that with me right now.
Okay.
I can say we're not wildly out of the norm in the metro. To get specifics, I would have to go back and do a little research.
Do we ever do exit interviews with teachers of color that leave to find out why they're leaving?
I'm going to turn that over to Abby once again.
Okay, so we don't really have a good idea as to why teachers that meet that category are leaving? I mean.
Well, we didn't say that teachers of color are leaving.
Well, we're having difficulties retaining them. Or difficulties hiring them, or both.
So one of the things to keep in mind with this current Achievement Integration Plan is we are about to enter our baseline year. And so, I mean, there are across the board less teachers in our district, partially due to the pandemic. So one of the things that we're going to be doing in 2023 is taking our baseline then to determine what will our projections be for growth as a key indicator of goal number 2.
Okay. In regards to one of the goals, I believe was, or measurements rather, was to achieve less suspensions for BIPOC students. Is that correct?
That is one of the key indicators, yes.
Okay. That is a good goal. I would love to see that. I'd love to see less suspensions for all kids. My concern is how you're going to achieve that goal. And I spoke to Superintendent Nielsen, and I know she spoke about, I can't remember exactly the term.
Restorative practices and relationships with kids?
There you go, restorative practices. Can you explain that a little bit better for me?
Restorative practices or the suspension?
Restorative practices.
So,
what does that mean?
When we look at decreasing suspensions, we don't want to overinflate that by just saying, you know what, let's stop suspending students. What we want to do is enact procedures and policies and behaviors that will reduce the behaviors that lead to suspension across the board for all students. So an example of restorative process would be one of the, this year is our first year of our racial harm response protocol. Now we know that there are some actions that are racially harmful that also constitute as bullying or as harassment. We have to address those based on our student handbook. However, we don't want to just stop at punishment or punitive. We want to look at and really explore why might students be exhibiting certain behaviors, and then pooling whatever resources we have to address those student behaviors so we don't have the recidivism of students potentially going back and repeating the same harmful actions. So when we're looking at a decrease in suspensions, it is truly a decrease in the behaviors that lead to suspensions.
So we're not altering the criteria for a student being suspended?
There's no proposal that we change the handbook at this time. This is strictly looking at employing actions that will decrease the behaviors that lead to suspension.
Okay. Katie?
When Abby mentioned 4% teachers of color, what percentage of students do we have of color?
Offhand, we're in the 40%
about
range.
40%.
Students.
40%
that
students of color.
identify as non-white.
So when we talk about a student trying to find somebody that they identify with that will also possibly help with suspensions, there's a huge gap between.
We wanted to be really intentional with that language because we know that it's not that students can only connect with somebody that is the same race or ethnicity. So we also put culturally in there because we know that the experiences that we have also make us more or less susceptible to having similarities or dissimilarities when it comes to intercultural communication. So we do want to make sure that our hiring practices are equitable. We want to make sure that our hiring practices are in service of trying to create a staff that is representative of our community. And also know, with the staff that we have, we want to empower them with the skills and resources to be able to connect with all students all the time.
I think at one point, Katie, when we first were on the board, and Abby, you correct me if I'm wrong, I think our goal was to increase the teachers of color by 8%, and I think we came in at 5, didn't we? 5%, or are we?
Yeah, those numbers could have been closer to a couple years ago. Right now, we fall right around 4% total for teachers of color.
And I think the difficulty with hiring the teachers had something to do with the licensures. Coming from other states, there was some type of glitch or complication that they had put in place. And I think that
there are a number of factors that may lead to shortage of teachers that don't identify as white. However, one of the things that we do want to do to address that is there was a stat that was thrown out about how teachers teach in the communities where they live. And so if we have students that are being shown an example of what it can be to, the positives of what it can be to be a teacher or an educator in our district, that's how we get the ball rolling on a Grow Your Own program, for instance. Right now, we're looking at what do we do to retain the teachers and the staff? How are there ways that we can empower staff that maybe don't have a license to aid in getting their full license? But like I said, there's a number of reasons why we may or may not have teachers of color in this district. Because we're in a baseline year, that's something that we're going to investigate and explore and try to respond to.
Okay, any more questions?
This isn't really a question, it's more of a comment. I didn't have a single non-white teacher until I was like 20 years old.
Sure.
So I really appreciate the intentionality behind this because I think it's really, sometimes it can be really challenging to be in a space where no one in a position of authority has any understanding of what your life experiences are. So I really appreciate this, and I'm glad we're focusing on this for the next few years.
Anyone else?
I got a couple more questions, if you don't mind.
No.
You talked about culturally affirming space. Would you mind giving me a definition on that, or I guess what's the district's official definition?
So we don't have like an adopted definition of culturally affirming space, but generally it's a space where all students feel seen, known, included, and cared for. So to see your race or your ethnicity or your culture, which those are not all synonymous terms, reflected in the materials that we use in our teaching. Whether or not you have a teacher that looks, sounds, or has an experience that is exactly similar to you, we want to ensure that the spaces that our students are in, all of our students, that they're seen. that they are heard, that they are affirmed for who they are, that we don't ask students to change for adults, that we do what we can to get to know who they are as learners and as people, and then adjust our instruction accordingly.
Appreciate that.
I have one question. Oh, are you done?
Nope, you go ahead. I'll take a break.
I have one question for you. I know this is achievement and integration, and all I hear is integration, but I want to know about achievement, especially in the elementary. I know that our reading scores, there's a huge gap, and are we addressing that with this money, or is there other money that's taking care of that?
So it's important to remember that achievement integration money is supplemental. So we have reading programming in our elementary. Now, one of the things that we're doing to supplement that reading programming in our elementary schools is the use of academic success coaches, who will be used to specifically to do interventions, reading, math, and or behavioral interventions for students. Specifically, students at our sites that have the highest rate of free and or reduced lunch eligibility, and also looking at race and ethnicity, the racial ethnicity diversity within our schools as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
James, when you talk about like what the funding going for academic success coaches, are we spending any funding, or is this already baked into the funding we do for, you know, for example, like classroom materials or books or whatever that are more appealing to a wider range of kids?
So there's a portion of all of this funding that is for materials, but like I said, a majority of this is for FTE. But there are some things, you know, for instance, we will purchase student materials that they may be able, if they forgot a notebook or a pencil, they can go to a cultural liaison or to one of our multicultural spaces if there's a need that they have, because there's a trusted adult there for them. But by and large, the funding is for direct student services, mostly through AVID and FTE.
I'd just add to that, Mr. Reed. I would offer too that during our curriculum review process, that representation is part of the resource review. So it's embedded in everything teaching and learning does, and then it could be supplemented with information from the A&I plan. But our normal capital budget, all of that, that is a criteria as part of that. Okay. Yep.
Hey, I got another one for you.
Yeah.
It indicates in the plan that staff will be required to attend 3 trainings every year in cultural competency. Can you describe one of those trainings for me?
Yeah, so these staff, and so we focus a lot of staff development is like geared toward teachers. But we also know that we have like 50% of our staff that are non-teachers, and we want to make sure that they are empowered with the same resources that teachers have to make sure that students feel safe, affirmed, valued in all the spaces they're in. So the PD that we've done in the past and that will continue for specifically our non-instructional staff really revolves around the skill sets of almost like customer and public service. Do we know how to have effective intercultural communication with each other? We're focused on self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. So when we're training our instructional and non-instructional staff in cultural competency, it's really around those 5 areas to ensure that they know themselves, they know the things that they're bringing to the table when they come into the workplace, and that they've got the skill set to be able to interact effectively both with colleagues and with students, and with families as well.
Okay, and then one of the measurements involves that was listed involves family and students in the BIPOC community that can demonstrate a yearly increase in understanding of student rights and opportunities.
Yeah.
How do you measure that?
It's a great question. So one of the things that actually came out in our strategic planning process is, do all of our families know all of the things that are available to them? And so one of the things I go back to is we focus a lot on K-12. There's a ton of programming from birth and beyond 12th grade. Both through community education, we offer adult ESL, adult GED services. There are a lot of things that our community can take advantage of, and we know that not all of them know that it exists. And so when we talk about empowering our families, we want to use part of our time and our funding to go out into the community to connect our community with the things that are theirs. The other part of this is, for students who want to be involved in activities, students who are looking for extracurricular opportunities, we want to make sure that there are no barriers, or as We want to eliminate as many barriers as we can to students being able to participate in extracurricular activities as well.
But I guess my question still remains, how do you measure that?
I'm sorry, yeah.
No, that's okay.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a hard question to answer.
Well,
so I
it
get
really, I mean, it's a sentiment score, right? And so we
Right.
can look at engagement, we can look at our families accessing our website, our families accessing our online registration, and are we going out into the community? What's our rate of connecting with families? This may also come out in survey data in terms of perception, because a lot of this, whether or not it exists, we also want to make sure that our families know that it exists and they can feel the impact. This is one of the benefits to our Achievement and Integration Plan being able to adapt as we go, means that we can really align the efforts with strategic planning so that we don't have to over-survey our community. We can, because these are common themes that are coming out both in strategic planning and in achievement integration, we can combine those efforts. It may be a survey, I can't say for sure because we want to land first. What exactly is it that we want to measure? Then we'll get to the methodology, but it could be measured in sentiment score on a survey that goes out to our community.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Any additional questions? Thank you, James. Okay, we are.
Well, you've forgotten before.
Okay. You're my girl. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
All opposed?
Okay.
Were there opposed? Eric. Okay. Motion carried.
Thank you.
Next is, thank you. Next is 9.0, and that's our superintendent's report. And that will be given by Julie Nielsen.
I'm going to talk quickly because our kids they're not really realizing this was that long of a meeting. And they're being mesmerized by all the numbers, right, kids? I do just want to clarify, we've heard a couple of times about free and reduced lunch, and I think it was shared that we're at 15%, and actually we go back and use the school district report card from MDE, and that's about what it says we are, but currently today we are at 25%, and so when we think about our free and reduced lunch, we're about 1 in 4, so 25%, just to update. I've heard that number a couple of times this evening. Also, Emmy next to me reminded that she was happy to stay because she doesn't have school tomorrow. It is a K-5 prep day, and she's going to sleep in tomorrow. And then, of course, Monday, February 20th is a no-school day for President's Day. I also wanted to take, February is Minnesota School Board Recognition Month, and we'd like to recognize our elected board members who give their time and energy in support of high-quality public schooling for our students. School board members in South Washington County Schools are entrusted by this community with responsibility for an annual budget of over $336 million. And with our early learners, over 19,500 students birth to age 21, 3,500 employees, and 26 buildings, departments, and programs. School boards are charged with making decisions that can be difficult and require sifting through a great deal of information. South Washington County Schools, during my time, has faced a number of situations from budget reductions to an operating referendum to our August bond referendum, and now working through strategic planning, driver shortages in transportation, and planning for the future of the district with a facility plan. We'd like to take this time to thank each of you for your time and role in serving as a South Washington County School Board member. On behalf of the Executive Cabinet, we say thank you with a little bundt cake from our very own bundt cake shop, along with an MSBA certificate. And so on behalf of the Cabinet, a thank you to Eric, Pat, Melinda, who is not able to be with us today, Louise, Simi, Katie, and Sharon. Thank you for your service.
With that, we move into 10.0, our future meeting dates. We have a school board workshop meeting on March 2nd, 2023 at 6 p.m. and a business meeting on March 23rd, 2023 at 6:00 p.m. All meetings will be held at the District Service Center. And with that, 11.0, we are adjourned.